Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And today I'm finally getting around to making that video on how to put the pockets into the patchwork skirt. So if you're new to my channel and you haven't seen the how-to videos on making a patchwork skirt, I do have a few of them because I've changed things as I've gone along. So I'll be linking to each one of the videos up here in the iCards. So go ahead and check those out one at a time. You'll see them coming across in the banner. And again, if you missed the banner come out, all you have to do is hover your cursor over the screen and you should see a little eye pop up here. Click on that eye and you'll see a drop down menu of all the videos that I'm linking within here. So I'll probably link about 4 different ones showing me making the patchwork skirt. Today, I'm only focusing on how I do the pockets for that. So the first thing that you want to do is when you're laying out your skirt, you always lay out the top tier first. And I'm going to show you here a couple of pictures of the top 2 tiers laid out on the floor here. So you can see the 6 on the top, and then there's 12 in the second tier. And there you will see the pockets laid out. So the first thing you want to do when laying out that second tier is decide what colors do you have the most of, are you most likely to want, or fabrics you want to use for your pockets, because those are the ones you're going to want to put on the ends, you know, on either end, and in the very center. It can be either number 6 or number 7 or both. It's just going to depend on how you want to do it and all that. So as you can see in the images I showed you, I use the same color for both sides of the pockets that are going to be on one side, and the same color for both sides of the pockets that are going to be on another. Now right here I have the beginnings of another pocket I'm going to be cutting out for the skirt that I'm actually wearing right now, which is a skirt I made myself about 1.5 years ago, and back before I started doing the pockets. And so I've already added a pocket on one side, on the right hand side, and this is going to be the pocket for the left hand side. And you can see I have 2 different colors, because this side of the pocket is going to match the red square and this side's going to match the gray. But I could have gone either solid red or solid gray. Either way, it's going to keep the pocket hidden. It's important that the fabric matches at least one of the 2 sides of the pocket. That is what is going to keep it more hidden from being obvious. In fact, one of the skirts that I made for Stacy, it was her denim, it had lots of denim in it. She didn't realize I'd actually put the pockets in her skirt, and she happened to find them later because they're so well hidden. And they're down on the second tier so that they're not adding so much bulk to the hips. Now, another thing you're going to want to decide before you get started is that where you want your pockets. Maybe you want them on the first tier. If you decide to do it that way, the way you place the pocket on there and go to sew it on is going to be different. And you just have to keep in mind that if that's where you want it, it's going to be right at the hips when you put that in there. That's going to be more preferable for people who need a longer skirt and are adding more length to the top tier of their skirt in order to get maybe a 38-inch length in the overall, or 36-inch or whatever it is in the overall length of the skirt. Because my skirts as is with the 10-inch squares comes out to approximately, its finished length is about 34 inches. Okay, now right here I have my second tier ready to go together. You can see how I use a clothespin to pin it all together. This is after I stack them up the way I want them. I always, after I lay the skirts out, I pick them up from the right side and then the left, stacking each new piece on top of the next. So this will be the place that I start from and working backwards. And so I've got one half of a pocket here, and the other half of that same pocket is going to be on the back side. Is going to be the last piece that I sew on. And then right here in the middle, you can see these corners sticking up. This is the 2 pieces for the pocket that will end up in the middle of the strip once I have it all sewn together. And then obviously once I have the skirt all put together and I go to stitch down the side, I will then stitch these 2 halves together. So what I have here is when I cut out my 10-inch squares, or I rip them out actually, I will pick whatever colors I want and then just take a couple of those squares, and those are what I'm going to cut my pocket from. They're, you know, it's already ready to go. The pocket fits in there just right. So you're going to want to create your own pattern. when I made this pattern, I actually just took a pair of scissors, had a square, and just cut it out. Just going by what I thought felt right, and that's the same pattern I've been using all along. So just to give you an idea of the measurements of this side here, the part that's going to be sewn onto the skirt itself, the length of that is 8 inches. Okay, this is the first time I've actually measured that. And then the pocket from this corner down to the longest point here is about 12 inches. Okay, so that should give you a pretty good idea. And then let me go ahead and give you the measurement this way, which is about 7 1/4 or 7 1/2 inches. So that will give you an idea. And then obviously once you have it, you want to make sure it's pinned in place, especially if you're going to cut out 2 pieces at the same time. Oh, and the other thing you want to keep in mind is when you're cutting it out, consider what side's going to be laying against the pocket. So you want right sides to right side. And if it's going on the second tier, you're going to lay the pocket right here when you go to sew it on. You're going to have it line up to the top. If you're going to put it on the top tier, you're going to want it to sit as low as possible, so you're going to want to sew it down here. But since this is on the second tier, I put it as high up as I can get it. And then I'll be stitching these sides together so that when you unfold it, it should look like that. You should see right sides. This is really important to get this right. So when you lay these out to cut them, consider which way you're going to want it. You want your right sides together. So make sure if you're cutting out 2 at the same time that you've taken time to figure out which way this one is supposed to be facing. So in this situation, you're going to have right sides together. Now, if these were both the same color fabric, it wouldn't matter which way I was going with this, as long as the right sides were together. But if you're using 2 colors like that, you got to be a little more careful to pay attention that this is going to be correct when laying against the red square of the piece I'm sewing it onto, and same thing applies to the gray side. Okay, so then obviously you're just going to take your scissors and just cut them out. But yes, when you're cutting out more than one at a time, you definitely want to make sure it's pinned in place. Even if you're just doing one, I've cut them out without actually pinning it into place, but if you're having several layers of fabric, it's more likely to move on you. And there we go. Now I have this ready to put in. And I may do a separate video down the road if people are interested in how do we put the pocket in an already made skirt. That's a little bit more complicated because obviously you're going to have to rip out the sides to get your seam ripper and open up the side and then put them in. But I can talk about that in another video if people want to know how to do that. Okay, so now I'm starting with the piece that was farthest to the left when I laid out my skirt and the first half of that pocket. Okay, and I like to do it this way where I start from here, and on this first one I find this is best. If you want to sew it this way instead, be sure to pin it in place. Right here I just do it this way. I don't bother pinning it. There's not that much fabric to get in my way on this side. And then I make sure my setting is pretty tight. I always sew any part of the pocket. I use a much tighter zigzag stitch than I do for the whole rest of the skirt. Okay, so it's going to take a little bit longer, but they've got to consider the pocket is where it's going to get some of the most wear on it. So you want a good tight stitch. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on. I'm going to switch this back to a medium length of stitch, medium tightness, and I'm going to sew the next 5 squares on. And I will get back to you when I get to the middle pocket, or it's not in the middle, but you know what I mean, middle of the tier. Okay, so I have my 6 squares, my first 6 squares of the second tier all put together, and so now I'm ready to start putting the pocket in or the next pocket in. So this one is going to go this way. Again, this one doesn't have a right or wrong side. It's the same either way, so that's no concern. But you do want to make sure that this right side to right side. Okay, and then again, I'm going to adjust my tightness to much tighter than the regular. And then sew that on. And yes, this is a treadle machine. It was bought new as a treadle machine. I didn't convert it. And I do have videos showing how to sew on a treadle machine if you're interested, and a link to this below if you're interested in this particular treadle machine. I love it. It's been my very favorite machine of all my many years of sewing. Okay, so then I'm ready to, this is the 7th square on the tier. So I just lay this here so that the rest of the tier doesn't fall off the table. It just holds it in place. And so I'm laying this, again, this would be right side to right side, onto the 7th square. So you notice the difference. Notice how this is laid that way, this is laid this way. Okay, and I'm still using that real tight stitch. Okay, now that I've got those two done like that, I simply fold this over this way, just open it up. Okay, you see how that is? And now I'm going to match up the pocket. Match it up from here. I usually lay it there first, and then if you feel better about it, you may want to pin all this in place so it doesn't move while you're sewing. And again, I keep my stitch very tight, especially on this part, because you got to consider if people are going to put heavy things into their pockets at all, you're going to want a good tight stitch. This is where it's going to take most of the wear. And if you notice, every so often I'm hitting the reverse stitch on this to lock it into place even more, just to give it even more strength. Especially in places where I think is most likely going to take some stress. Or you could do an even tighter stitch than that. I just like making sure it's done very well and it's not going to come apart when, you don't want people putting keys in their pocket and then having a hole wear in it and eventually, the keys fall out. So I want to make sure that's not going to happen. So what I do, let me put the needle in place, is I'm going to turn this. So you see where the stitching ends on this, where the pocket is connected to the skirt itself. I want to make sure I go up here to that stitching and meet up with it. Okay, I'm going really slow so you can see what I'm doing. And now I'm going to turn and then come back down and sew the rest of the pocket together. And I usually still keep it on a good tight stitch to finish that out. Now, at this point, double check your back side, double check here, and make sure none of this moved and that you don't have any holes. This looks a little questionable to me, so I may need to stitch across there. So I'm going to check that by opening this up and taking a look at it. That actually looks pretty good. I am going to go ahead and stitch this just to be certain, because there's a little bit of funny look to it there. So I'm just going to follow that up just a bit and lock it in place. Because again, these are all the areas that are going to take the most wear and tear of the whole skirt. Okay? Then from that point on, I change my setting back to the looser, not quite so tight zigzag, and then I continue laying the squares out and finish sewing this tier together. And then all I have is one more pocket piece to put on here. Okay, so now I'm down, I got my last piece. I'm down to sewing on the last piece of the pocket. And adjust my setting for a tighter stitch. That, of course, is going to be a matter of choice. I just think it's the wise thing to do is just have a good tight stitch so it's really well enforced in that, on that seam. Okay, so now this tier is finished. It's all put together. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first tier that I already had put together. Notice I have a clothespin on the end. I always do this except for the tier with the pockets on it because it's already pretty self-explanatory. But with all my other tiers, I always put a clothespin on the starting end, the end that I started sewing with. So that tells me I'm going to lay, this is the end I want to start with when I go to sew the second tier onto the first tier. So I'm starting with the end that I just finished, okay, and just to double check, lay it like this. You want to make sure the pocket is pointing downwards and not upwards towards the top of the skirt. Okay, and so then I just start sewing it on here and bunching it like I do. If you have an automatic ruffler, that's one thing I've always just done everything by hand. So if you're doing it by hand like I do, I usually take the two where the two squares meet, because of the tier that you're gathering, you're gonna gather it so there's two squares to each one square of the previous tier. And so what I do is I'll put that seam right in the center, and then I just try to bunch the whole thing up like that, getting it as flat as I can, and then just sew right across it. And I always like to do a little lockdown every time I hit any place where there's a seam, any place where any squares are meeting the other. Okay, right there like that. And of course I go over that in the other videos, and I talk more in depth about how to lay out the patterns or how to lay out the fabrics, just to get the best look and so on and so forth. Okay, so then when you get to where your pocket is, just make sure that all the seams are lined up. So and this is a mistake I made, is because I'd laid all these fabrics out, and when I went to pick them, just so I could take those pictures, when I went to pick them back up again, somewhere I screwed up when I picked up the pocket pieces and I laid them in the wrong place. And so I had to take all this apart and re-sew it together. So if you remember, the pocket was actually next to the royal blue and the light blue. But now I had to move it over so it was next to the teal. And I figured that out because if your pocket ends up in the center of a square, you've got it in the wrong place. So I had to take all that apart. So double check and make sure that your pocket ends up right along another seam. And then just sew across the very top of the pocket, but then move the rest of it out of the way, and then continue on with the rest of your tier, putting it together. Okay, so now I have the first two tiers put together. The pocket's in place. Now I'm not going to bother sewing these two halves of the other pocket together until I have all four tiers put together and on the skirt, and then I go sew all the way down that side. So I'm going to sew here, and then when I get to here, I'm going to set it on my tighter stitch and then go around the pocket all the way down, doing the same as I did on that first pocket. Then I'll readjust to a little bit looser stitch and finish out the skirt that way. Now the last thing I want to explain, I don't have the third tier put together yet. I'll be doing that here soon. But what you want to make sure you do is that when you go, notice how this pocket is sticking out from the bottom of this. So as you're sewing your third tier onto this second tier, you don't really have to worry about it here with this pocket, because you're going to start from right here when you sew it on. But when you get to here, it might be wise to count out the squares, because when you get, or you count out either the bottom squares, so you're going to be counting up to 6, or count the squares, each one that you're bunching up here on the third tier, up to 12, because you're going to put 2 to each one, so that will be 12 squares up to where the pocket is. And you want to be paying attention to this because of the fact that this hangs out the bottom like this. So as you're putting that top tier on, let's just say this is the top tier, and I'm sewing it on here, I want to make sure this isn't sticking out the bottom and then sew right across the top of it, because you're going to not only shorten up your pocket, now the pocket isn't going to be able to move freely. So when you get to here, make sure you push that pocket way up here out of the way and double check and make sure none of it is down here. So you're not stitching it down to the skirt here. It needs to stay free and loose on the inside of the skirt. Okay, and that's it. That's how you make the pockets. It's actually pretty simple. It just requires a little bit more time and a little bit more fabric, but if you put the pocket in as you're sewing the skirt together, that's the easiest way to do it. Okay, so I hope that's understandable and that gives you a place to work from, and I will go ahead and insert a picture right here of what this skirt looks like when it's all finished, so that you can see the finished product. And having that pocket, having those pockets in there is sure nice to have, and I'm glad I finally remembered to get around to doing that, to creating the hidden pocket for the patchwork skirt. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.